Hi, I'm Adam Steele for the Hot Pole Studios. If you've not seen me before, welcome to the channel. And this behind me is my 5 iPad multi-touch surface. Let's check it out. So the iPads are iPads, they're fairly self-explanatory. But the software behind this voodoo magic is called TouchOSC. It's something I've talked about before. I did a video about this. It's had a few thousand views, but this is the kind of the logical conclusion. This is the real kind of craziness. And the thing about TouchOSC, or just OSC in general, is kind of the intention of OSC is to eventually replace MIDI. Not necessarily in terms of notes from keyboards, but for everything else we've started using MIDI for, which is things like touch surfaces and controllers and faders and messages between devices in terms of control. Because MIDI is very out of date at this point in terms of a control situation. It can only send a couple of numbers which have to be the same on either side and interpret it properly. It has to be sent over a cable unless you get a very expensive wireless solution, and it's generally just kind of dragging on a little. I mean, in terms of notes, like I say, it works fine, but OSC, Open Sound Control, is the next generation. It's based over Ethernet, so you can send it over Wi-Fi, you can send it over wired networks with very, very little latency if it's an internal network, which it should be. And you can use it at the moment, as far as I know at the moment, with Ableton Live, Logic and Reaper, and probably more as well. You can use it for controlling live video and things like that, which I've not gone into myself. I'm an audio guy, really, so this is what I do. And Reaper is my DAW of choice. So the smaller iPads, I got these as refurbished units. You can use TouchOSC on pretty much any iPad, iPhone, or Android device. I mean, I actually have TouchOSC on my phone as well, and it might seem a little bit silly, it might seem excessive, but one of the things that you can do, apart from having kind of here, if I just move this to a set of faders, I've got 40 faders in front of me. Now, I originally learnt on an analog desk, so I know how a desk works, but then I've spent most of my production career using a mouse and keyboard, because that's kind of how computer production went, and unless you had a massive budget or got employed by a big studio, you went the computer route. So that's how I learned. But it is nice sometimes to just be able to reach over, and if you can hear that something needs turning up or down, not have to scroll through the mixer window, and just be able to reach over and just go click. Now, this is my iPad Pro, and I don't usually use this for faders. This is kind of an extra. I usually just use the 4 that are on the desk. But the thing about any of these, but this one just happens to be not plugged in. The other 4 have got power lines, which just stop them from going dead mid-session, is that I can just pick this up, and because it's on Wi-Fi, I can walk into the live room, and as long as I'm still on the Wi-Fi range, which I am, I can start and stop and change anything in terms of the mix remotely, which means that if I'm working a session and I've got, I don't know, a singer-songwriter, a guitarist, needs some drum parts playing, so then I'm going to be the session drummer, that means that I can set everything up properly on the computer, set the mics up and everything, and I can wander in there, and at my leisure, I can put this next to me, I can fast forward and rewind through the track. If I can't hear a particular instrument or the click, I can change the levels and just hit record. And if I didn't like it, I can hit stop, record again. It's got a loop button, it's got all the major controls that you'd want. Which means that life is so much easier, that I'm not running backwards and forwards. Which, if you've not got an assistant with you, which a lot of people don't, then that makes my life easy, because an assistant would cost me, I don't know, £40–50 a day, I guess. Or the TouchOSC app was about £7, $7 or $8. And the iPad Pro I already use for work stuff, so I already had this. But if you got iPad Mini 1s, because hell, you don't need a lot of processing power on the iPads for this, because it is just a screen. And I was originally doing this with Tesco Huddles, which are like really old Android tablets, and it's only when the iPads became available to me that I made the switch. So a lot of the videos that you'll have seen behind me, you'll have seen 2 of these devices that were actually Android devices, so it works cross-platform, which is fantastic. Did mean I had to buy it for Android as well as iPad, but for the amount of time it saved me by being able to do session work in the other room, or if I really wanted, I could give one of these each to members of a band in the live room, and they could then go to another one of these windows, because the next window along is all the send levels. So if I made a separate stereo send out to the headphone amp for each member of a band, they could then completely change their own mix in their own time without me having to get one of those multi-thousand-pound systems with the really clever kind of self-mixing stem stuff, which are great, but that's a lot of money. And if I can just give that to those guys, if I trust those guys not to smash the iPads to pieces, I mean, I could always say, you break it, you buy, but that just, I can change banks, and unlike things like, I don't know, the banks of faders, physical faders that you can get, a lot of those don't have scribble strips, you know, at the top where it tells you which track is which. With all of these, with it being digital and on a screen, it can tell me through the feedback, and that's another thing about OSC rather than MIDI, it can send text. So every one of these channels I can see strings group, violin, cello, bass, DI, acoustic, anything that I've named it within reason as long as it's not too long, that name comes up on here, so I can see at a glance exactly which channels I'm changing, because that might sound obvious, but it's very difficult in a digital system to remember what track number goes with what instrument, because as soon as you, I don't know, let's say I add a third rhythm guitar, which is right in the middle of the project, suddenly everything from there onwards gets moved up a number, because every track has to have a number, but then it's thrown and it's gone, and all of your faders move, which if it's digital, hey, they've all moved on the screens, and they've not all had to physically go. And the other thing is, sometimes if you've got automation, you can see everything. Gobbler tray has stopped working, that's fine, I don't use it anyway. You can see everything on screen. You can even change every parameter of every effect on every channel, if they're made available through automation, that is. If the plugin designer has made controls available through automation, they're all here. It might not be the actual interface itself, but if I'm in a live room, say, and I'm playing on the drums and I find that, I don't know, the kick drum's got too much click in it, I mean, not as a mixed decision, but if I was just playing and rather than get out from behind the kit and run back in again, I could probably find the different pages, yeah, high shelf gain, low shelf gain, of all that kind of stuff in here, and then just tweak it, hit go again, and I'm off. And that is fantastic, and having this absolute craziness is something that you can do too. I mean, for Pro Tools they have their own remote software, but TouchOSC is great, and it doesn't take much to set up either. You connect to your iPads or Android devices or phones up to the same wireless network that your system is on, make sure that your firewalls are set properly and all that kind of stuff, and then for Reaper particularly, you just go to Options, Preferences, Control Surfaces, you add a new OSC device, and you go into the settings for OSC, which I'll just take a little photo of. I'll put that overlay here, and all you do is you make sure that the IP address that it tells you is what you put in Reaper or Logic, and then you put the computer's address from Logic or Reaper into TouchOSC. Make sure the ports match, which if you're using one device will be 8000 and 9000 by default, but I'm using multiple, so they have to have their own port each so that they are separate and they don't get confused and get horrible crossover, so they all have their own channel to talk to the machine. And that's it, hit done, and you pick which layout you want as well, because there are different ones. If you're using Ableton, there's one called Live Control, which is all pads. There's loads of ones in here. There's one that's just called Beat Machine, which if you're using Ableton and you want to be able to do drum stuff, that's a nice simple one in there. There's Logic Touch, which is the one that I would tend to use on a phone. I mean, this is massively oversized, but you can see single fader with a pan and track names and everything, which is a bit overkill, but you just make sure the same layout is set on the computer, and that is it. And then, yeah, so Logic Pad is the one that I'm using, which is essentially Logic iPad. But if I went to one called Mix 16, yeah, so I could mix 16 completely different faders in here, but it doesn't say which one's which, but that's because I've not got that set. But it is dead simple. So I'm back to my Logic setup, and Reaper just pretends it's Logic, and that just works. And there is, as far as I can tell, pretty much zero processor overhead, because it's never affected me, and the more and more devices I add into this, doesn't seem to add anything up. I mean, you can even, if you want to get crazy, add in something like my Yamaha DMC console, which is an old MIDI controlled motorized fader desk, and using something like a program called Pure Data, you can convert OSC into MIDI and back. I mean, it's advanced, but it's doable, and it's something that I've done before, is have like 8 flying faders so I can physically control them, which is more useful if I'm doing something like a bit of film scoring or film voiceover work, where I can see on the TV that's above that desk when people walk in scene, and I can pull and push and do the pans as I see the people come on screen. So there is a massive scope for OSC, and in terms of controlling hardware and control surfaces, I really think it's the future. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you've enjoyed this and all this craziness. I know that like 90% of you guys who watch this video are not subscribed to the channel. Please hit that subscribe button. We really appreciate that. That means that we can keep doing more of this kind of crazy stuff. And check out our Patreon page, because as I'm making this video, there's still only one guy helping us out on Patreon, and we could really do with the help, so please go and check that out. Thanks for watching. I'm Adam Steele. I'll see you in the next video.